everyone, my name is Tania, and welcome to episode 8 of the most interesting people on my timeline. This is a multi-platform series exploring how digital spaces affect the lives and work of my most interesting online friends. If you're new here, welcome. Make sure to check out all other episodes anywhere you get your podcasts and or on YouTube, and to make sure to visit taniadoes.com/interesting people for all links mentioned in this episode and for bonus content. If you're not new here and you're watching the video version, right now it's just all audio. I've been playing around with some formatting for the podcast, but I think that by next season it'll be all sorted out and it'll be more standard. But there will still be visuals of the conversation that I had with today's guest, so y'all can still have that visual stimulation if you really need it, if you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching the video podcast on Spotify. Today's episode features Sandra Riaño, a photo editor, writer, and storyteller from Queens, New York. Shout out Queens! Sandra has done some amazing work for publications such as Rolling Stone and curates a newsletter on Substack to highlight Latinx artists and photographers. You can find more info and links to Sandra's work in the description box or on taniadoes.com/Sandra Riaño. It's Riaño, but the Anya doesn't really translate to URLs. Anyways, it's all linked below. But welcome to episode 8 or season 2, episode 4 of the most interesting people on my timeline. Let me introduce you to Sandra.
My name is Sandra Riaño. Currently, I'm a photo editor at Rolling Stone, but outside of my work life, my personal life involves a lot of research and writing around Latinos in American history, and specifically Latinos as it pertains to their photographic practices. So that's a big umbrella of my research. I'm also an artist, so I love connecting with other artists and studying contemporary Latino photographers, amplifying their work. And because I studied history in undergrad, connecting that work to a broader, larger history. And so those are kinds of the themes that I traverse, and a lot of the questions that are kind of central to this work for me are how Latinos or how non-white photographers find and use the political potency of photographs to document their communities, to preserve stories that might otherwise not make it into our history books. Yeah, that's like a little smorgasbord of the kinds of things that I do. I am Latinx. I was born in Colombia and raised in New York on Long Island to working class Colombian parents. That also colors a lot of how I approach my understanding of art from a working class diasporic lens. And I'm first gen.
I first met Sandra or found Sandra and her work on because of a podcast that she was doing called Nosotras, and then I followed her on Twitter and just started seeing her work. I signed up for her newsletter and loved her newsletter. It will be linked below so y'all can sign up for that. It's really great. And I was like, let me talk to Sandra more in depth about photography, which is a medium that I've been trying to get more into. And this conversation was just great. And she let me know just how she got started with photography, specifically with Latinx, Latino narratives and aesthetics, and what led her to develop her newsletter and her body of work and research in photography.
To backtrack a lot, I studied history in undergrad, and I focused on 20th century American history, particularly Puerto Rican radical history in New York. That's what I was studying. And the great thing about the 20th century is that cameras became much more available to consumers. So a lot of Latinos, for the first time in the 60s, there was this surge of us making our own photographs and documenting our own communities for the first time, or rather, in a much larger degree than we had been documented before. And so as I was doing this, work in history, I was coming across images, particularly of the Young Lords in New York and the Black Panthers, and seeing the work that was documented of their organizing efforts. And it kind of just planted a seed in my head about Latino photographers and documenting and how that squared into how we understood history, because oftentimes Latinos are not included in American history, right? We have to go to American studies or Latino studies to learn about ourselves, but we don't see ourselves in a regular survey class of 19th or 20th century American history. And so in the absence of that history in my classes, the work of photographers that kind of made their ways into articles I was reading, or books that I was finding, became like a supplement to my understanding of what Latinos were doing in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Fast forward to my senior year, I'm tracking the Latino photographers that I'm coming across, and Elizabeth Ferrer, a curator and a writer, produces her book, Latinos, A Visual History of Photography in the US. And it's this groundbreaking survey of Latino photographers across the US. And it just became kind of a light bulb moment for me that this work that I was finding, the threads of the work of artists and libraries and stuff, that there was a larger story there. And so the work for me, the Excel sheet that I had, which was just that, an Excel sheet of like different Latino photographers I came across, it lived on my computer. And I wanted a way to engage the work that I was finding and this kind of bibliography that I was constructing in a visual way. And I wanted to be able to connect to other people about this kind of work that I was doing. And so the newsletter was very much inspired by a curator who I absolutely love, Kimberly Drew, or Museum Mammy, as she's known on Instagram. Went to Smith, and she publishes a newsletter herself called Something I Saw, where she shares contemporary Black art with her audience, like when she comes across something interesting. And so instead of just keeping my bibliography on an Excel sheet, I started just posting it on the newsletter. That way, the photo that I came across that was most compelling was like right there and a visual way to reference the work. But also it became a way for me to reach out to the artists themselves, talk to them about their work, and then share it and connect with a community of artists, scholars, writers, curators who are interested in this conversation surrounding Latinos or diasporic art making. And so the newsletter kind of, long story short, started as a bibliography for myself and then became this place where I could visually reference Latino artists and connect with a community of people who were interested and invested in a conversation surrounding what Latino art looks like. One of the challenges, and I'm sure you found this in your own work as you're trying to reference other filmmakers, is that there's a misconception, both like in media and then in academia, about Latin American art and Latinx art, right? Like oftentimes when they're going to reference what they call Latino art, they're referencing Latin American artists who were born and raised in Latin America. And oftentimes those very artists square into the hegemony of class privilege, of being white, of being men. And so they do not reflect the experiences of diasporic, of Chicanx, of Puerto Ricans who grew up in New York and not on the island, of working class artists. They do not reflect that kind of sensibility. And that's a huge challenge. And so that was also another kind of thing that I wanted to make space for in the newsletter, was just really carving out that this was about Latinos growing up in the US and not Latin American artists. Not that they don't have their place, but that Latinos in the US are understudied in that sense.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is all like personal research, or do you do this like, oh, it's like all personal. Okay.
All personal research, yeah.
So yeah, that's like I admire that because I saw that, like you said, we have a lot of parallels in our work, right? So this like podcast series kind of archive, it's my own personal like work and research. I'm not getting like paid to do it or anything. But I still think it's important to do because other people aren't collecting that a lot of times. So I just really appreciate that. I just want to let you know. And yeah, I don't know, like I think it's important to uplift that as well. And so through the newsletters, like why was that necessarily the format that you chose? I know you were inspired by that other newsletter, but what made you think like, okay, so this is going to be the format for me to share?
Yeah. So really, after Elizabeth published her book, I was really inspired. I felt that for sure this was the start of a longer conversation. And it was also the first time that I had seen, museums start to really reckon with their gaps in their knowledge about Latino artists. And so I just wanted a way to keep adding artists to my list, but also I was really just like, when you do this work on your own time, it is one, extremely hard. So I commend you for doing this, because finding the time afterwards to, present an interview, to source like people to interview, and all the work that is a labor of love, really. And like you said, is incredibly significant, because this is the kind of stuff that's missing. It's super important. But also at the same time, it can be very lonely and isolating to do that by yourself, right? And so a lot of my research was self-directed. This was kind of outside of the confines of my major, because history is very like text-based, and especially like Western history loves primary documents, sources, like that's what they consider history. And so visual images don't really square into how we read and understand history. So a lot of this work was on my own. And I guess I came to a place where I just felt like I wanted to be in conversation. I wanted to talk to other folks. I wanted to connect with people. And also, I wanted to connect with artists. And this seemed like a really good way to continue doing the work I was doing, but also be able to start forging some of the relationships with artists that I admired. It like became a way for me to talk to curators, to writers, just because I was passionate about it, and it lived in a place where they could also see it, because sometimes our work that we're doing just lives on our computer, or like the thoughts we're having about the kinds of stories we want to tell. And it's really good to be able to move that work, or some of it, into a space where others can access it too, and you can generate conversations within community. So the newsletter was that for me. It became an ability to bring in community into some of my like personal research.
And what's like the timeline for that? How do you go from, research to putting out the newsletter? How do you go about that?
Yeah. So I had been doing research for maybe about a year before the newsletter came about. And I kind of hit this stalemate because I'm about to graduate. And so I'm not in school anymore. And so no one's like asking me to turn in a paper. I'm not, presenting my arguments to a teacher. And so now that I'm out in the world, I have to ask myself, like, how do I move my learning along? Like, what are the byproducts of the research that I'm doing? How do I know that I'm like advancing my knowledge of this space, of this topic? I didn't know how to like mark that for myself. And so the newsletter became this kind of cheat. So that when I felt stuck, when in my research or my thinking or writing about Latino photography, this was an easy thing that I could do, going back to the basics, finding a photographer that I admired, pulling out a photograph that I liked of theirs, and having a conversation about it. And so it actually nourished my research. It kept me going, because every time I felt stuck, or if I just didn't want to think about Latino photography for a week, or just my head was I had writer's block about an idea or something, I could just go back to talking to another artist and getting inspired again and keeping my research going. So I think a big thing for me is that when you're doing personally directed research, finding ways to keep yourself encouraged in what you're doing. And I don't know, it's also really gratifying to connect with community and have folks affirm that the questions you're asking are valuable, because we know them to be valuable, because we see their absence. But also, it's just really good to have someone else say, yeah, that question, should be answered, or I appreciate you asking the question. Just reminding ourselves that the questions we're asking are important. So I forget now what the question was that you asked me, but the newsletter helped me connect with folks and helped me keep my research going when it felt like hard to do by myself.
Yeah, no, I think as you're talking, I forgot my own question, to be honest, but because you're talking about something that's like really interesting. And maybe like another question that prompts for me is what are the avenues you use to connect with people? Like, where are you messaging them, or how are you connecting with them?
Yeah. Yeah. So I was a long time admirer of many photographers, and I find many of my photographers, or the photographers that I'm highlighting on Mira, on Instagram. And, there was a sleuth of scholars who I admired, and I read their work. But there was really no way for me after graduating that I could like connect with them, it's not like I was writing a paper and I wanted to talk to a scholar about their work because I was including it. And so my connection to this particular topic was kind of an outsider or a researcher from a very particular vantage point, which was I was observing the work of artists. I was observing the scholarship that I felt was important. I was taking all of that in, but it was kind of just living in my head, right? Like all of that stuff was just living in my research and my work. And then the newsletter kind of broke that fourth wall and allowed me to just, come out and talk to people. It also meant that there was something tangible out of my research or interactions because I wrote something about the work and I could go back and reference. So it was a good way to break the fourth wall because, even if you're doing this work or not, or you find yourself or you think yourself to be a storyteller, a lot of our work in our day-to-days is going to live maybe just on one side of things. A lot of our work or research rather might just like end up in a term paper or in classroom conversation, and then where does it go from there? So this became a good way to take that stuff and move it a step further.
Right. And speaking about like Instagram, I also like have seen yours and like read a lot of like the cool captions that you have on them. They remind me of kind of like the way that somebody that I will be interviewing for like another episode for this, Che Applewhite, does Instagram as well. He's a filmmaker, and he also like when he posts, he like has these long captions about like this backstory or like reflections upon the work that he's posting about. Whereas like sometimes like on my personal Instagram, I'll just post like really short things or like something that is silly. How do you think that those captions add to your own personal photography work that you put on Instagram?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think for me, it's like a visual diary of like my process and my practice, because oftentimes and I'm sure you encounter this problem. I think artists and creatives encounter this problem where you have so many ideas in your head and you're constantly just like, oh, there's so many connections. And those are great. But often, like, I experience the point in time where they kind of die because like, there's just so much and you can't possibly get to everything. And so Instagram is a good space for me to kind of take some of the questions I have pertaining to photography and write them out and write out or reference the scholarship that I'm reading in that moment that is helping me shape an idea. And it's also been a really wonderful way to connect with other artists, especially and particularly women artists and women writers who are having the same questions. And through like my long captioning and the conversations I've had with folks who have engaged with it, I have been able to move my thinking in different ways. There are things that I thought about photography when I started out that through my process of writing and captioning, as I'm like developing my process as an artist, have changed. And so it's a good way for me to just keep track of scholarship that I'm like interested in, the questions I'm having, and the kind of folks who are inspiring the dialogue. Oftentimes I shout out like folks who I'm having conversations with, that week or in that time that prompts something in me to reflect on something in the darkroom. So it's like a visual bibliography.
Yeah, I also kind of think it's like a really cool way to bring yourself back in, because a lot of what you have on Instagram is might be portraits of other people, right? But it's still like your Instagram, and that's where you bring yourself a little bit back in through that commentary and the captions, right?
Right.
Yeah. And like that's just like kind of like what I some thoughts that I had like just looking at your Instagram, because like I actually originally found you through Twitter. I believe you were promoting the Nosotros
Mhm.
podcast, which I don't know if you still do. I don't know if you still work in the audio space, but thinking about photography, thinking about audio and the culminate, like how those things can intersect. Could you talk about your work in the audio space and if they did ever intersect with your work in photography?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like yourself, being a producer and a writer and a filmmaker, for me, photo editing and audio and writing and research, the thread of all of that work is storytelling. you know and so I fell into audio first because I had been blogging for like 7 years. I have blogs at every season of my life, and I came to a point when I was at Wellesley, where I wanted to try that kind of same narrative, like self-driven story, but I wanted to test it out in audio, and I had fun doing that. And so I worked in the audio space for about a year. I worked on a couple of projects, Spotify's Loud, The History of Reggaeton with Futuro Studios, Gimlet's Resistance, which is like a weekly podcast that interviews activists on the ground who are making change. And so all of those were ways for me to explore storytelling. And I think what's interesting about audio is that you have to develop a practice of listening, right? Like you have to develop a practice of both listening to others when you're interviewing and making sure that you're cued into the person's story and making sure that it's navigating and flowing and you're hitting all the major moments. And then as a listener yourself of audio stories, you have to be committed to like settling into it. And that can be really hard, especially when we're living in a time where visual driven, like just seeing visuals is like the best way. And particularly not static images, like video is the way that we like feel ourselves best told a story maybe. And so that kind of seeps into photography, because in a time right now where video seems to be holding audiences a lot stronger than photos, I have to come back to myself and ask myself what my practice of listening is and what it demands of me. And if I believe these photographs are important, developing a practice of listening to them and sitting with them and reflecting. And so personally right now in my own work, the two worlds haven't crossed. Like the work has been, I've worked on different projects in each, but I do have a great example of how the work can intersect. And a photographer who's Puerto Rican, he lives in New York and he crosses between the island and New York constantly, Christopher Gregory Riveras. He took this photograph of FBI surveillance files that they had on Puerto Rican radicals who, you know, were pro PR sovereignty or independence. And he took this photograph and he just called it Las Carpetas, right? These are just like files that he found in an archive. And then he worked with WNYC on a Puerto Rican podcast called La Brega. And they did this episode where they go into the files that he photographed and pull out some of the names of the people and go back to the island and ask them about their experiences being Puerto Rican radicals. And, you know, you're able to take this static image of just like FBI files, and through the audio story that he tells, you're able to just go into them. And it becomes a very immersive story, and it becomes a completely different way to understand the image, to understand the lives of the people who he's photographing, who you might glance at the photo and not understand the depth of what that surveillance meant for folks and how it tore friendships apart. So there are really interesting ways where audio and photo can come together and add tremendous depth to how we're understanding just a visual photograph. So yeah, that's just one example I thought of.
Yeah, and I think for me, in my experience, like it's been in film and in audio, and photography was always like a medium of like, okay, I think I always looked at it as like, oh, I think a picture is pretty, right? And it took me a long time to understand the storytelling behind a picture, right? And it wasn't until I think I saw the work of like I believe it's Cristina Fernandez, and then there
Yes.
was another photographer. I'm gonna look it up real quick because
Mhm.
that picture
Yeah.
and those photographs actually where I was like, I think I was in San Francisco and I was at the museum there, and I looked at it and I was like, okay, I understand that
Mm.
how there's a story here. I was like, yeah, it might just be like one image, but I actually like see so much, like I see a story in it, even
Yeah.
if it's not like the traditional time-based like a video or an audio that tells you a
Mhm.
story in time. Paul Sepuya, his work that I saw like in the San Francisco MoMA was just like, that was also one of the ones where I was like, okay, I get it now. So maybe my question for you is like, how do you approach storytelling when you're like, okay, I have one image to share. Am I going to approach this story? Like, what's your
Yeah.
process in photography?
So the context for the story that, or the context for what you've just shared with me, reminds me of a question that I was grappling with a couple of months ago, which is, where does an image start and end? right? And I think what you're getting at is like, is the end photo like the end stage of it? Is that the last ultimate truth telling element of the story in it? And so for me, the answer is complicated. I think the short answer is that the story does not end when the photo is made. The story is in the process of it, and much more than like the material object of the photograph, the story, I think, of that photograph lies in the heart of the artist, right? And so when I'm thinking about the artists that I really admire, Hiram Aristani, he just passed away. I have his like, little funeral reception book right here. He photographed Spanish Harlem, and he loved his people. He loved his people. He loved El Barrio, and he made it so known. And you can feel that in his photos. But I think knowing who he was as a person, now when I look at the photos, there's just no way I can't feel the love that he has for them come through in his photographs. And that's the same for a lot of photographers that I follow. To not make that so complicated, the first time I come across a photograph, I try to just take it in visually, like what does it signal to me? What feelings come up? And for me, in that immediate moment, that's the story. It's like whatever comes up for me. So I have a ton of photographs like up on this wall. So this is a photograph that I took. And, it felt like important to take, these two flags together. Or this is a photograph that I found in the darkroom where I print. And I just knew that a Latino took this because there's like, I don't know if you can tell, but it's El Nino, like the little Saint Mary, like that all our parents have on their end tables, I was like, I know a Latino took this photo. So the first story is always just like whatever feelings come up when I see it, right? And then this next stage is like the investigation. Why was the photo made? Who made it? What were the conditions or the context for their making it? What did the photo mean? Who saw it? Where does it live? If it's in an archive and few people have seen it, what does that mean? Or if it's a photo that's been widely seen, what's the story that people tell about it? So it's always the initial photo. The initial story is just my feelings. And then the second story, I think, is the deeper investigation, the who, what, why of the photo. Particularly for me, it's an investigation of power and politics, because image making is political. It is not something that's accessible to everyone. And that tells a particular story itself. So there's so many layers. But I encourage folks who don't have a practice of reading or listening to images to not be so overwhelmed by coming to a photograph needing like curatorial knowledge or art knowledge. Or for me, art is real. Art is like you feel it, like of course art historians have a particular or curators have a particular way of like reading and understanding art and collecting it and what's important or not. But before all of that stuff, growing up, I knew what art was because I could feel it. If I saw a street performer like performing on the subway and that inspired like a feeling of like, that's beautiful, I knew that that was art, right? And so I encourage folks who don't have maybe a reading practice of images to just not be so overwhelmed, to come to an image with whatever feelings you have, in the same way like that you might walk away from watching a film. Just whatever is interesting to you, that's the story in that photo, right? And like whatever is coming through you and your heart is like fertile ground for investigating and understanding a photograph. And then the other part is of researching and digging behind how it was made, where it's kept. That's also like a really interesting story that one could, tell about a photograph. And that's very much a part of my process. Is I come to photographs and I'm like, they're great, there's something beautiful here. And then after, for me, it's like, who made it, why? That process is extremely important. And it's especially important when it comes to Latino image makers, because so many people aren't asking that question. So many people aren't asking us why we're making photos or what they mean for us or why they're politically significant, right? For me, images are not just something that could be beautiful, but they can also signal a political thing that's incredibly important.
I love that. And actually, like the thing that like gave me chills almost when you were like, art is real. And I think that evokes something that I've always thought about, kind of like you said, like people might always try to have like a certain opinion or like the right opinion about art, or make sure that they know the right meaning about a piece or about anything, but it's like whatever you feel, whatever you opinion like that invokes within you, that's art. Like that's the opinion, that's like the statement that it makes, whatever. Like it's personal. It's personal.
Yes.
But I really appreciate
There's a writer, Rene Ricard, and he's an art critic, and he wrote this piece in Art Forum in like the 1970s. And I bring this piece up to everyone. I read it almost 8 years ago, and it is the definition for me of what art is. And there's this paragraph in this 14-page essay he writes about graffiti writing. But there's this particular paragraph where he asks, what is art? What is it anyway? And he ends it by saying that the bourgeoisie have made art a scam. You cannot tell someone who's used art to enslave how you used art to be free, right? The bourgeois, like in their museums and what they consider art, and this painting of a blue sky is worth $40 million because we said it was. You can't tell someone who doesn't understand what it means to make something beautiful out of something ugly, what it means to, dress up. Like I think of our parents, just like the plastic fruits in the bowls, or like the ways, like there's a lot of kitschness, in our families, like how we decorate things, but there's an art to it, like photos and stuff, like galleries of our parents putting up stuff about our families, and combining that with like Jesus and statues and all of that, like it uplifts it, right? It's like our own curatorial wall, and our parents know what art is, and we know what those things are. And it's hard to tell people who come from a particular background, who have access to wealth, who make art to be this like really difficult thing that you can't tap into. Like that's what they have to make it, because they can't possibly understand how we connect to art just living out in the world. Like they can't grapple with that definition, because if it's accessible to everyone, then it's not really art. And that, I don't believe that. I believe that art is, however, like when you see something beautiful, when it moves you, that is art. There's no complicated definition for it.
I 100% agree. I like whatever feeling you have, like that's valid.
Mhm.
And that is an art criticism. Even if you say, wow, that's beautiful, like that is
Yeah.
a valid statement about art. I really appreciated talking to Sandra about this, an appreciation of art and photography, a lot of things that I am very much aware of right now. I would love to know y'all's thoughts on this though. If you're listening on Spotify, there should be like a community or like a questions or discussion section on Spotify where you will find a poll, and I'll just put like a question and there will be like choices, or it could be a very short open-ended question. That's just so we can connect a little bit better as like a timeline, as a community. I'd just love to know your thoughts if you want to throw them out into the void that is me and my analytics my analytics review of this podcast. Or you can just go on YouTube and comment there. There will be no prompt. It'll be completely up to you, whatever you want to comment. Let me know. How do you appreciate art? How do you appreciate photography? And what makes art art? I don't know. Let me know. Let me know in the comments. When you're talking about like profit and like consuming, that makes me like, I'm questioning like perhaps like NFTs, right? And like how
Mhm.
that has shaped it, images and image storytelling. I don't know if you have like any thoughts about that. I've asked a lot other people about it, but I feel like I always find a new perspective each time I ask.
Yeah, of course. Very complicated. The short answer is, for me, is NFTs bad. you know, Bad for the environment. Also, for me, the troubling thing is that while I think that now in the digital space, like there's a lot of artists who like rightfully are very upset that their work is stolen all of the time. If you're an artist and you put images up, like places like magazines will lift a photographer's work if they're not reputable, and they'll lift it and take it without asking. And it's very hard if you're like doing this on your own. If you don't have like a lot of like know-how of like legal things, you might not know that you could fight that. So I understand people thinking that NFTs are the answer to it because it means that someone owns it. But for me and my politics, that's really troubling. The idea that ownership, that it means that that's the real thing. I don't believe that, you know, in order to be legit, in order to be real, a piece of art needs to be tied to its owner. that's really troubling for me, as someone who is like anti-consumerist, anti-capitalist, that we, you know, suggest that the answer to places lifting the work of artists is like to make ownership even more clear. So I struggle with that. At the same time that I understand that for a lot of artists, there's a particular artist who I love their work. They're from Houston, Joe Rubles. They make documentary work, absolutely beautiful work. And just with the state of photojournalism today, it's hard to make a living off of that work. And he has been able to take care of himself and his family through NFTs. So I know I have complicated feelings about the environment and, how NFTs like signal, conversations around ownership. At the same time, I can understand that for first gen, for working class, for POC artists, this might be the first time where outside of like the traditional getting their art legitimized by a curator, a photo editor, if someone in that space, they can just do it on their own. I recognize how that's needed and why that like might be a good thing for folks, like why that space is sorely like needed. So I have complicated feelings around it. Overall, I don't love the idea that we need to tie art to their owner, to know that it's the real thing. I believe in art being like completely available and free to people. Some of the art that's like made the most impact on my life has been like public art that I've seen. Right now, there's an incredible graffiti artist in Washington Heights. His name is Snowman. If you go on Google Maps and you go down Broadway Ave in Washington Heights, you will not like go down one street without seeing like a bodega or like a cart or a corner that he's painted or something. And that's like freely accessible to people. People walk past his work and feel happy, and it's beautiful and it's like for the public. That's like, I consider that to be art, just because one person doesn't own it, to me, doesn't take away its legitimacy as like a piece of art.
I love that. And I think I have similar sentiments. And from what I've talked to people, they also have it like similar sentiments because of also, in addition to that, like the complexity of NFTs and like you said, like ownership and like the environmental factors of it, as well as like just like how new they are. Like we don't, if this is the world we're going into, like is this going to be like how it works? Is this going to be the system that works under, right? um I think it's scary sometimes to me, I think.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
every time we do have those conversations and like people talk about like, is this where we're moving? I always ask myself, like, well, who's deciding that that's the value that's inherently important to society? I think overwhelmingly, I'm seeing this as a photo editor now, like in the print industry, it's really difficult. Like print is not as strong as it used to be. Like things live digitally on our computers, on our screens. And so the era of like a strong like printed magazine is like, unfortunately going away. But I don't think it means that as a society collectively we have to say, oh well, then that means that print work is devalued. No, at the end of the day, a company, a corporation has decided that for its bottom line, it's not profitable to print anymore. But we can say holding a photograph tangibly is significant, and we're going to continue doing it in our own lives. And also like, not to get too fatalistic about like the future and stuff, but we also have to be committed to a practice of like how we want art to live in our lives, because it's very easy to let screens and things digitally take over, right, and do the work of like, storing our art for us. And we have to be committed as well to like the things that we value. If we value like seeing art and feeling it around us, I mean, it would be scary to live in a world where like walls would be bare and the only kind of art we could experience would be on the screen. So I don't think that'll ever end. Like, I think we will always surround ourselves with the things that we value and that we care about.
Yes, this series is called The Most Interesting People on My Timeline. For this segment, however, I turn to my featured guest to put me onto something new and tell me about the most interesting people on their timeline.
One of my favorite people is a food writer. Her name is Bettina Makalintal. She's Filipina and she's a reporter right now at Eater. I love all of her writing about food. very politicized writing, just adds a lot of questions about how we understand our relationship to food, the history behind food. She interrogates a lot of like what Asian American food is, like food critics write about Asian food, but she like really problematizes what that means. And she grew up in a suburb, I think, in Philadelphia. So she's also like problematizing elitist food critics who only go to like really fancy city restaurants. She's like, what about Chili's or Applebee's or like those restaurants people used to go to, like working class neighborhoods, go to this like little joint, right, for a celebration. Like I love how she writes about food. Another person who I really enjoy is Eva Recinos. She's a queer Latinx art writer, and she's been doing a lot of art writing about Latino art and specifically photography. So, you know, people talk about like scholarship, being a ways to like create knowledge, but Eva Recinos, I think it was like 5 years ago, created one of those listicle, like where you just list out like 10 people you should know right now. And she made one for like Latina photographers. And when I tell you that was like my Bible when I started, like just going down the avenues. Like she listed these 11 people, and I was like, oh my God, who are these like folks? I love all the work that she's doing. And then a photographer who I love, Lauren Noel Oliver, Puerto Rican and Cuban, and Puerto Rican and Filipina, and all of her process, her photographic process is really beautiful to observe. She's someone who's like committed to like an understanding of herself. She's one of the few Latinx photographers who I have found who do self-portraiture most deeply. I actually have her book right here, A Temple of the Self, and it's really beautiful. And just like turning the camera inward, as much as like turning the camera out and photographing our community is important, I also think about like what does it mean to turn it on yourself, you know and as a filmmaker, like, and in the work that I do, we're often like talking to other people, and I think about like what is like when you turn that stuff around, like what's the significance to that as well. So those are some of the folks on my timeline who I think are really interesting.
Sandra's also doing some amazing work outside of the digital space, in photography, in curation, in museums. And in this next clip, she talks about some of the work that she's doing in DC for the Museum of the American Latino.
Right now, I'm working with two scholars, Dr. Joanna Fernandez and Dr. Felipe Hinojosa, on a book, and we're working alongside the Smithsonian Museum. And the American Latino Museum is going to like fully open to the public in 2025. And in 2024, we're going to publish a photo book of the Latinx freedom movement in the 60s through photographs. So right now we're taking a look at 4 major cities, Houston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York, and gathering all of the photographs of like major Latino, like on the ground activist movements, and putting together this photo book. And I'm really excited for like that to come out and folks to see it. I think Elizabeth broke like ground publishing a visual history of Latinos through photography in 2020. And I think that this is like another book that adds to that visual history that's sorely needed. So super excited for that to come out. Other than that, like I'd love for folks to check out Mira if it's interesting to them. That's on Substack. I am Local Mujer everywhere on Twitter, Instagram. So you can find me there. And Mira is a great space if you're interested in either like connecting with Latino visual artists or learning about like that space more yourself. Yeah.
As always, you can find all links in the description box of whatever platform you're listening on, and you can find more content on taniadiz.com/Sandra Riaño. Thank you so much, Sandra, for this amazing conversation and insight. I think we spoke for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, just about anything and everything. Like, I couldn't possibly fit it into this episode. So if you do want to check out a little bit more of our conversation, you can go to my website and it'll be under bonus content. So you can watch that if you want just a little bit more of what we talked about. That's it for this episode. You can listen to all episodes anywhere you get your podcasts, with more information available at taniadiz.com/interesting people. The next episode is so exciting. Number one, it is my first in-person interview. So let's make some noise for that, for some real life connections. And two, it is the season 2 finale. Episode 9 is the end of the road for this season. So stay tuned. It was such a fun episode to make, and I speak to a slayerific stylist, designer, performer, vinyl collector, and personal assistant to literal queens. Stay tuned for the next episode. Make sure to follow me, your host, on Instagram at Tania Does, and to follow the social pages for this series at Interesting People Pod on Instagram and TikTok. Stay connected, stay creating beautiful things, and I will see y'all in the next episode.